You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
The longest running show in the world about data in year 16. It's DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, here with a couple all-stars of the data industry. We're going to talk about a model for a data-driven business. Yes, indeed. We got a typo in the crawl. Oh, well, it happens. A model for a data-driven business. And we're going to talk to a couple experts today. You know, data modeling is something we've talked about for 20 plus years now. And you construct a data model really to optimize the flow of data, to optimize transactional systems, analytical systems. You want to be able to get the most out of your data. And traditionally, data modeling has been done on the data. So we sit there, we look at it, we try to figure out what we want from it, and we come up with a model, a schema, if you will, and we load our data in accordingly, and we see how that performs. In the old days, changing a data model was hard. It was kind of a pain. It was a really difficult thing to do. You would have to take a system down for a while to load it up again. Well, that's all changing, and everything is changing these days, of course. And we want to map these data challenges to our business to understand. And you know what's cool about a data model is if you get it right, it represents your business. Because of course the data represents your business, but the flow of data through your organization, that's what the data model facilitates. So if you can look and see where data is moving in your organization and let that kind of tell you how to model the data, well, that's the best case scenario. And that's where we're going these days. I've been watching the Databricks Summit online the last couple of days. Amazing things are happening. Of course, we have these large language models that are coming out. We have small language models that are being talked about. There are lots of different things that you can do to leverage these technologies. And folks, we are just at the beginning. I mean, this is really quite a remarkable point in time, probably as remarkable as the early days of the internet, quite frankly, which is a big deal. So we've learned a lot over all those years. I credit open source software with helping us get a long way in the last decade or so. And a lot of the people who are at the center of this industry focus on open source as well. So we may talk about that a little bit, but really we want to talk about data-driven. How do you become data-driven? And our first guest knows all about that. A veteran of SAP who is working over on the HANA project, SAP HANA. I've talked in the pre-show about my love for Hasso Plattner, a superhero of the enterprise software world. We've got Prakash Darji from PureStorage. So Prakash, tell us about yourself and what you're doing in the world of data.
Well, so Prakash, I've been with Pure about 5 years, right? And, you know, I've been in and around the data segment from a database and an infrastructure standpoint. And what's interesting is to see some of the intersections between the two. So, you know, obviously, if you think about data modeling, first you have to think about data collection and where's data generated, what generates data. And yeah, you know, we've formed this thesis based on the evolution of what's going on that data will largely be generated from a lot of different places, right? Whether it's applications, whether that's on-premise, that's in the cloud, that's at the edge, in multiple countries, multiple geos. So I think the new data cloud is a distributed data cloud. Like I think your data will sit anywhere. And then, you know, the data modeling and management problem is more of an IoT problem then because you're actually managing a bunch of data endpoints. How do you collect the data from those endpoints? Whether they happen to be databases or storage systems behind someone's firewall or in a public cloud or in an application, you got to bring it together. So here at Pure, we collect across, you know, our storage systems in different data centers around the planet about roughly 20 petabytes annually of data phoning home. We have to assign semantic meaning to that data and you know, use that and, you know, where can we use it? It gets interesting, right? I think you were talking about a little bit of where large language models are going. Well, like hypothetically, let's say we get to the point where we structure all of the information that we see from a customer interaction point as a time series, meaning that, you know, I know every touch point I've ever had with a customer. Now, structuring that data is easy because I've had semantic meaning and we've been doing that for a while. If I look at, you know, training large language models on public internet, you know, in the ChatGPT space, for example, I would say the internet right now has more information than it did 10 years ago. but I would say information quality has deteriorated 10x. So if you train your models on public internet data, you will more confidently get the wrong answer faster in a large language model. So I do believe that, garbage in, garbage out is today's problem in data. I do believe building semantic meaning and structuring information over time becomes more important. And, we can do and use large language models in our customer interaction where, we have Jira for our bug management system. We have ServiceNow for our ticketing system. We have all of our telemetry and our customer interaction data and, our support cookbook data, but we could build a generated technical support engineer at some point that actually allows our technical support engineers to, diagnose and pre-resolve cases through training, right? And as our support engineers find new issues and learn new ways of doing it, we can train our models. So we're already, given that we've been collecting and structuring and modeling our data and our customer interactions over time, doing that. And part of that, I think you can see probably from a Pure perspective in our net promoter score, right? And we've had customers use us for a while. We've got, exceedingly low churn. And I think generally we treat our customers right in terms of customer intimacy. It's all data driven because in our world, it's just a managed endpoint that we run and operate and manage using data.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's a very good point. And the semantics are huge, right? I was curious to hear you mention semantics because the semantics allow you to know roughly where data should go or how it should be used, how you can align one data set with another. But I think you're right about this federated view of the world, right? And it's funny because we went from the data warehousing world, which was to pull it all into one central location. Then the data lake comes out. Let's pull it all to one central location. And it's like, guys, are we making the same mistake again? And I think we kind of were, but now there does seem to be a much greater appreciation for data gravity, for the fact that, data does have this pull to it and you kind of want to leave it where it is. And just the cost and expense and risk of moving massive amounts of data around, even though we can do that much faster now. Apache Spark, of course, came out and really rewrote the rules on how quickly you can process that data. But just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? You ideally want to let data sit where it is and come up with clever ways to access it when you need it and to do your analytics and your operations that way, right, Prakash?
Yeah, well, there's been movements in this space for a while. Sybase had this technology in the 80s called
IQ.
Data Federation.
Yeah, well,
right?
Sybase
Where
IQ
you can
too,
actually,
right?
Federate data. And if you look at Snowflake, Snowflake's got a concept of an external table today where, interestingly enough, we've got some customers, like we use Snowflake internally, and we've got some customers that we've created and share some of our data warehouse data that they can just SQL and join with theirs, right? Without copying the data. It's a data sharing kind of environment. So, and again, you have to deal with security and semantics and joins and master data and all sorts of things to make that work. But, think about the amount of data interchange that happens on a planetary level where all of the data is copied from so-and-so. Give me an interface from your system to my system, right? I think we're going to see the evolution of shared business processes, collaborative data environments. I do think that's going to happen in a distributed data world to run and operate on data efficiently. Because if you think about networking, I can ping a website anywhere on the planet.
Interesting.
Sub-second, sub-millisecond kind of pings. If you just kind of if I ping an IP address, I'm in New York right now. If I ping one in Australia, right on the other side of the planet, and typically that IP address will come back in some milliseconds in terms of a ping, a round trip. So this idea that it all needs to come together is an idea from yesteryear because the internet does allow you to access information in a federated way in a performant enough environment. Now, there will always be the real-time things where someone's waiting on a credit card swipe where that decision is sub-milliseconds. But most analyst kind of requests can work in a distributed way. So there's a nature for real time where data needs to come together. But as you're training and as you're thinking about this large language model problem, I think the trick is applying that semantic meaning to where data sits and being able to train based on the based on things that don't create bias. So, and that's what we're finding as we've been exploring these models and using them in our business.
That's very interesting. I think you're exactly right. Let's bring Tim in to kind of comment on some of that stuff and then pull on a couple of those threads. I'd like to get into this whole issue of data quality you mentioned, which is kind of interesting, especially when you look at the hallucinations of large language models, which you could argue is a very serious data quality issue, right? If you just make stuff up, I'm like, that's not so good. But we'll get to that in a minute. But let's bring in Tim Ryan from Aegis Sciences. Tim, tell us a bit about yourself. And of course, you know a bit about PureStorage too. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate being on the show. So I'm the CIO at Aegis Sciences. I've been with Aegis, almost 6 years now. We actually have some, good stories to tell, based on our relationship with Pure. Aegis, we are a leading national toxicology lab. Prior to the pandemic, we had a very small biopharma lab, which we actually transformed into a COVID lab during, unfortunate, pandemic that occurred, throughout the world. We actually performed over 14 million COVID tests, and for those that actually went to Walgreens to get COVID testing, the results probably came from our lab down in Nashville.
Wow.
So, so it's quite the story, with Pure. We actually had implemented Pure prior to the pandemic. And because of the scalability of their product and the ability to kind of dedupe the data and take advantage of their technology, we were actually able to grow our infrastructure rapidly, throughout the pandemic. And when there were supply chains issues through most of the world, Pure actually was able to provide additional, infrastructure for us as needed. So it really was a great partnership. So we really appreciate the abilities that Pure gave us there.
Yeah, and that was a great time for innovation too, right? Because all of a sudden, number one, everyone's working from home. Number two, people are moving around very much. So things like information architecture became top of mind discussion points to understand how are we going to get access to this data? How are we going to get this team access to their data? What are we going to do? Well, I can tell you that companies which had thought through their information architecture before COVID did a whole heck of a lot better than those that did not, because those that didn't all of a sudden had to scramble and figure out, and they were basically in reactive mode, right? But it was a time to kind of force change, a forcing function, if you will. And I think a lot of good came out of that in terms of innovations because people had to innovate. What do you think, Tim?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from our perspective, I mean, we were an organization there. Everybody was in the office, 5 days a week. Everything was done face to face. We had rolled out, Microsoft Teams in a, limited fashion prior to the pandemic. So we were able to spin that up, pretty much overnight, and be able to really change how people worked. It's worked extremely well. We still do not require people to come back into the office, so people can do their jobs, remotely. For example, I'm based out of New Jersey, and our office is in Nashville. I no longer need to go to Nashville as frequently as I did previously. But getting the data to the people at the right speed and time is very important. And with COVID, we actually, created a partnership with Walgreens, and we were able to actually share COVID indexes and publish them on a website with Walgreens to show everybody data real time on how COVID was going throughout the country. So that was a service that we provided because of our ability, to share the data, with Walgreens. Something
Wow.
that we're really proud of.
Yeah, data sharing. I mean, we heard Prakash kind of comment on that. That's another big issue. You used to really have to think about that in terms of modeling, but now you have companies like Snowflake with this external table. You have these data exchanges out there. There's a much greater appreciation for being able to share data at scale. And that's wonderful stuff. I mean, think about threat detection, right? I mean, I know in some industries they've been doing this for a while, but folks, if you know that there's a virus coming around, you've got the profile, the signature, the code, if you see how it behaves, to share that information quickly can save lots of problems, just like sharing information on health scares, right, Tim?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's all interconnected. and you have to take advantage of it, from how you source the data. I mean, Prakash was talking about, getting data in, right? Garbage in, garbage out. We deal with a lot of, physician offices and electronic medical record, companies, and everything's not in the same format. You have to synthesize it down. So you're making sure you're getting the data, coming into our organization, in a standard format. It's really key, so you can utilize that data appropriately. And we don't have an easy healthcare system, to work with,
Right.
because everything is decentralized. So making sure we normalize the data is a critical component to this, which enabled us to share the data with Walgreens, and other external partners.
Yeah, and that reinventing wheels is very expensive, and I think to kind of bring in the open source angle too, that's one of the best benefits I think of open source, is that now you have this collaboration around a particular component. First, of course, it was the operating system, but then we kind of climbed up the stack. One of the big ones was Hadoop, and that kind of went sideways, but I think we learned a lot of lessons in those days. But collaborating around code is just like collaborating around anything you're trying to build. And we really are in a new age right now in terms of all that. Real quick, what do you think, Tim?
No, absolutely. I mean, the world is really changing. You mentioned, the large language models. I mean, they're going to be something that, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Mhm.
So, how do you take advantage of that? How do you utilize your own data, using that technology to get the information, in seconds that might have taken you, weeks or months previously to get.
Right. Oh, yeah. So that, and time matters, right? I mean, you can get to something quickly, you can get to something in a day, an hour, but if it really matters to get it quickly, you need it fast. And this is where architecture comes into play. This is where modeling comes into play again, kind of understanding your business. And the other thing that happened with COVID is we had lots and lots of companies figure out they have to change their business models. Some companies did it very, very well. I think there's a story about Target, if I'm not mistaken, being able to go curbside in a matter of days. I think it took them like a week or something to change business processes to where they could accept orders and get it ready for a curbside. That is a massive change in a very, very short period of time. And, not everyone really understood what was happening. I remember when they canceled, it's a huge conference in Barcelona. I think it's the big, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like a cellular communications conference in Barcelona every year, and they canceled that. And that was really the beginning of the impact of the pandemic. And I was like, oh man, like this is a black swan, folks. Like this is going to get really, really big and really, really shake the world. And it sure did. But from a data and information perspective, we learned a lot very, very quickly. We were able to kind of optimize our businesses. And don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, welcome back to DM Radio. Talking to a couple experts today in the data world, of course. We're talking about modeling and how to have a truly data-driven business model. And these days, it's not hard to do. There's plenty of data out there. You can rent the data, you can buy the data, you can generate the data yourself. Your first party data, this is going to get interesting, folks, because Google, of course, keeps talking about the end of third-party cookies, which is going to fundamentally change how marketers get information. It's going to fundamentally change how we target things, how we target who to sell to. It's a really very disruptive move that, may still not happen. We'll see. They've pushed it out a couple of times, so maybe it's not going to change the way they thought. But these large language models, goodness gracious, to be able to point them at the corpus of your text in your business, of your unstructured data, right? So structured data is, realistically, is it even 10% of data in a large organization? It's probably more like 5-8% or something. And all the rest is unstructured. Well, these large language models are really powerful engines for being able to absorb and then parse information. And they are really predictive engines is what they boil down to. Their job is to predict which next words you want to see. Well, of course, Google was doing that a couple of years ago now, when you would notice you're typing in Gmail and all of a sudden it starts finishing the sentence for you. That was clue number one, like, okay, we're getting somewhere. And then Copilot, of course, with GitHub, Databricks is talking about their Copilot now helping you plan things out. It's really amazing. And these engines are going to be just like super energy packs for organizations that use them well. And I think we're finally going to be able to do some of the more very interesting things in this business, which is to let the data tell you what's happening, let the data and the flow of data in your organization show you what a data model should look like and show you how you can optimize for your business. But Prakash, I'll throw it over to you. I mean, you have all this great experience from SAP as the GM on HANA, which was a huge deal. And now you're over there at PureStorage, where again, you guys take this very interesting consultative approach about how to use these data drives to enable agility, to change, to transform businesses, right? What do you think, Prakash?
Yeah, to do anything to drive any business, you have to think about a data maturity model. Like the first step is just collect. The second step is you have to assign semantics.
Yep.
Right. And then you can start doing things like reporting and analytics and then predictive and then, LLMs, and finally just take the action and start, autopilot, right? Generative. So like that hierarchy of like, where am I at on my data maturity journey, I think is interesting, where we like to think about, applicability around this is one, there's an application in terms of how do we engage with customers, right? Mm-hmm. That is a real material application. Because I believe, just like technology stacks come and go, like databases have been around for a while. Right, data lakes are around, ETL tools are around. In the early days of predictive, R became popular, R library for predictive analytics and that type of thing. And this is just now a new widget in your application development stack, right? And how do you procure that widget, and how do you build your LLM models, and how much storage, compute, network, and appliances, and all of those things aside, this will normalize into, I think, a long-term new piece of the application development stack when you're building an app, right? Yeah. There's mobile development, there's application development, there's databases. There's going to be this idea of this, model, right, as part of any application development. And, interestingly enough, I think we talked about, data sharing, but, Tim was talking about how they share data. Epic, in the healthcare space is a big customer of ours. They've standardized some things on, the patient and access and that type of thing, where a lot of hospitals and regional hospitals, at least in the US, use an Epic system for patients. I know it made it easy when I go to 4 or 5 different hospitals to log into My Health Online and be able to see my records of my data and from a few different places, right? It'd be nice if I had one way where information privacy allowed them to all share it in a way where I didn't have to log out of this hospital and log into this hospital and all of that, right?
Yeah, right.
Now, the first step in kind of being able to build a model for my health would be, that information sharing piece. That's got to be sorted so it's not locked up and siloed in one place or the other. And, there's always this trade-off around information privacy versus information sharing. But, then using it, I went through a lot of health issues in the past, and I know that there's an element, within, I've had a continuous glucose monitor to deal with, diabetes issues in the past and other things. And it allowed me to collect information. Why? Because the way we see some of this, health information going is nutrition is a statistics problem. You'll see things about paleo and keto and, every diet from Which Way and Sunday, but from a math model standpoint, there's not, the human population is not uniform. What works for one may not work from another. That's right. And I'm really interested to see where these large language models can go from a personalized nutrition and a personalized medicine standpoint. Right. If you think about societal impact around humanity, I think there's huge applicability in the healthcare space.
Oh, yeah. And AI in general has just tremendous potential, I think, in healthcare more than probably any other industry, if only because in healthcare and life sciences in general, and I'll throw this over to Tim, there are so many more dimensions. I mean, there are lots of dimensions to running a retail company, but I would argue that there are really realistic, if you want to talk about features that matter, features that can have some covariance, that can change something in life sciences, you're talking tens of thousands, if not millions of features. And that is extremely difficult to process. But again, some of the new AI technologies take much different approaches. I mean, especially these large language models. We don't have to get too far into that, but just AI in general, I'll throw it over to Tim, has tremendous potential in conjunction with data to analyze a corpus of information about certain diseases like diabetes, for example. We'll be able to much more quickly and early in the ball game identify people who are going to be disposed to diabetes, for example, and start treatments earlier, which, a stitch in time saves 9, right? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Eric, I mean, I think part of the paradigm that's shifting or has shifted is, it used to be you had to create the rules to get analysis.
Right.
Now you really don't need to do that. It's
Wow.
going to become, you have to ask the right questions,
Right.
to get the information that you're looking for. And I think that's going to be a huge paradigm shift, for people.
That's funny. I'm just thinking to myself, like talking to politicians, talking to lawyers, you have to ask the right questions in the right sequence and then kind of throw them a curveball to get them off script to figure something out. But it's like, if you could just look at the data, that's why I keep thinking about, the fact that we can tackle these challenges at such a scale these days is very, very significant. The fact that you can point an algorithm at the corpus of your customer service data and be able to ascertain, let's say, 23 different paths that are the most common. And then, of course, you're going to have all these other sort of anomalies on the outside of that. But then you can start hacking away at what are the top 5 problems that we see? Oh, it's people complaining that the charger isn't working. Okay, what the hell's going on there? Alert someone in manufacturing or whatever. The point is, you can get to the meat very, very quickly and not just be wasting your time. That's good for morale. It's good for business. It's good for all kinds of things. I'll throw it over to Tim to comment first and then Prakash. Go ahead, Tim.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of applications to this. I mean, another thing that's on the forefront, at least of my mind, I think other CIOs too, is IT security.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you go through all that data, and determine, is there some sort of a cyber attack on your organization? So being able to use that data in a manner that can predict or give you information, quickly is really going to become, more important as we make things easier to get data from, because the easier it is to get data, the easier it is to infiltrate it as well.
Yeah.
So we have to look at it from a couple of different lenses. So, data sharing is great, but you have to make sure you do it, correctly. And you also have to make sure you don't share someone's information incorrectly, from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, and there, this is a bit tangential, I suppose, but I think it does make sense. And I'll throw it over to you, Prakash. Zero trust architecture, right? We have these new concepts coming in. And of course, you also have microservices. I mean, that in and of itself, Kubernetes, Docker, these innovations, which are significantly game-changing. They also brought all these new challenges in, which is why all of a sudden you've got 80 different observability vendors out there at the KubeCon talking about different ways to look at this feed of data and that feed of data. And it's like, goodness gracious. I mean, it happened so fast. We did some work earlier this year with a company called Mesmo, and their whole thing is they sit on top of your machine data flow and they help you optimize what goes where and what you store where. Because even though at first you're like, data storage is cheap. Yeah, well, just wait 6-9 months till you have a whole mountain of data from this observability vendor and that observability vendor. And you're like, you're the CIO, your budget is blown. I mean, it's crazy how fast things are changing, Prakash. What do you advise to your clients about how to sort of tame the changing nature of our world?
Look, it's funny. I'm going back a long time though, in comp sci, and I went to University of Illinois. And we actually were educated on a mathematical formula around cost and value of data, right? Because we grew up in a rationed world at the time, like RAM was not easily accessible, drives weren't as big. Hell, we've got a 75 terabyte flash drive now, but there was a point where, the nature of that was all rationed. So, there were early principles when resources were rationed where you learned, okay, is this worth storing, or do I need to downsample, or do I need to run more compute cycles to go come up with the answer, right?
Yeah.
So I think some of those principles, apply now, where if you say, okay, companies' budgets and I'm curious what Tim thinks in terms of how his budget works, are generally pegged to GDP, right? CFOs are going to generally be like, okay, my IT budget is X percentage of revenue, and my sales and marketing budget is Y percentage of revenue, and my R&D budget is Z percentage of revenue. So it's fixed to top line, right? And it's fixed to top line in the rear from a business standpoint, meaning that okay, don't collect data and blow cost well in advance of, unless you're a startup in a non-public company, right? Well in advance of, as a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, you have to have financial discipline, and you're going to build that up. And as you're collecting this data, it needs to operate in a financial model that makes sense. So that does mean, okay, do I need to store every record or every 10th record? Do I need to store signal? So what we found and what we've ended up doing to solve this problem for ourselves is we make sure as information is generated, the thing that's generating the information can separate signal from noise. I think the idea of let's just collect all the logs off the machine, not going to happen anymore. I think that world is a legacy world. I think there's going to be, the machines need to be aware that they have a log budget. And if you have a log budget, you can't write crap that is not useful. Right.
Well, what's really interesting here is, I'm definitely picking up what you're saying, and I think you're exactly right. And the cool thing about this generation of AI and machine learning is you can build that as a factor. You can say, pay attention to this and watch out for this, and the rules can be dynamic too. You can kind of superimpose the rules, but you can also just, borrow
it's a
some and have
circular
some
real-time feedback cycle.
Right. It's reflexive, right? Recursive, I should say. Right.
They need to know while they're developing what the cost impact is of that. And this is the problem people had with writing cloud applications. And you hear CIOs say, my cloud costs are run away, because developers went amok. Right.
Interesting.
It was there's a lot of capacity there, and I can rack up the meter and the bill to turn super fast. Right. But, what creates good information architecture is scarcity.
Interesting. No, that's a good point. And you're also kind of talking about shift left, right? Shift left to where it's more in the dev environment. But what's cool is that we have enough data now that we can shift left, because we can kind of look right and see, okay, well, what was the impact of this? What was the impact of that? You can learn from these systems. And that's the key really of machine learning, is that machine learning algorithms can constantly crawl and troll for these things and look and see what's happening. And they're constantly watching stuff. And then if you monitor the output from all that, that's when you see, and then you can basically function that in the shift left environment and say, okay, when we've gone to use this module or do this thing, that has been the performance tax we've seen. So I can estimate now what the performance tax will be if we take this route or that route. Certainly in security, performance tax is always a major concern, right? Because you're like, how secure do you want to be? Well, how slow do you want your systems to go? We are getting a lot better at that kind of thing, but there's always going to be some tax if you build in this little monitor to sit there, this agent to kind of watch what's going by. But you can get more and more clever about that and more lean. And of course, you were also kind of alluding to code bloat, right? When the processors got fast, code bloated. Don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, having a ball of a time with Tim Ryan of Aegis Sciences Corporation and Prakash Darji from PureStorage, two very, very cool companies. And Prakash, maybe I'll throw this over to you. Things are changing so fast, but you do have to have a perspective on things as an organization, as a CIO. You have to know what your plan is. You want to keep some free play for being able to adopt new technologies, but you got to stay focused. Even if things are changing quickly, you got to focus on the business, keep things going. That's where the models do come in handy. What's your advice there?
Yeah, look, I think about the world as a general manager, so everything's a portfolio budgeting exercise in my mind, right? So I was like, okay, what percentages run the business? What percentages transform the business? Like how many? And that's not going to be a cookie cutter formula for everybody, right? If you're a large enterprise where you've got, I subscribe to some of the BCG, financial models of like, hey, is this a cash cow business? Is this a growth business? Is this a value business? What kind of business is this? Mm-hmm. And then in the context of that, you think about technology applications, meaning that, okay, there might be 80% of my business now that is running the business, and I want to ensure that 20% of my budget is going towards new bets, right? Because you could obviously, I'm sure Tim is a CIO, right? Probably could endlessly just respond to user inquiry or customer inquiry that has, I want this next thing, I want this next thing, I want this next thing. So you do have to set aside, and we do that in R&D, right? On the R&D side, as we're building things, we think about this as a portfolio. What percentage of our investment are going to making a better flash drive and flash array, right? And what percentage of our budget is going towards, large language models when we're, as a Fortune 1000 company and, at the growth rates we're at and whatever, we look at that from a portfolio investment and we isolate that capability because I think innovation, right? And, it's interesting. I'll give you a healthcare analogy since we have Tim on the line. I like to think about anything that is new at an organism or an organization is treated like a virus. Right? A company is an organization or an organism, so is a human body. And by definition, then, the organism is meant to protect itself with the immune system there to kill the foreign entity. Mm-hmm. So there will be people that reject LLM models because they're foreign, right? They aren't part of the run the business, how the business runs. And as a really, really bad analogy, if you think about how to beat that in the human body, well, if you study a cancer, it goes undetected long enough before it takes over the host. So when you're introducing foreign concepts, right, into an organization, isolating and protecting it, and ensuring that you give it the room to mature and grow. Because look, let's. I think we talked about this with the LLM models. Sometimes you might need to run 1 and 2 and 4 and ask the same question 4 different ways to figure out which one works, which one doesn't. Because there is bias in every model I've ever seen, right? And you have to understand what you're training against. And do you have an occurrence bias? Do you have a correlation bias? Do you have a recency bias? Like all these bias concepts exist in the way models work. So if you choose the wrong learning pattern against your data and you don't try enough different learning patterns to test, you're not going to find the right output. And LLM is about trying multiple models, right? It's not a single language model, it's multiple language models, so you can try different approaches. But I think that approach is protecting and giving it room to thrive, I think is critical in an enterprise today, and ensuring that you don't overdo it, right? I've seen companies rebrand saying, they might have been a backup company and now they're an AI company overnight. And I'm like, okay, what percentage of people are doing AI? You know what I mean? Like you have to be who you are, right? AI is like air. There's no such thing as an AI company. You're not solving AI. You're solving something else. You're applying it, right? Just like we all breathe oxygen. This should be part of your technology stack.
Yeah, no, those are really, really good points. And I like the portfolio approach. And I'll throw this over to Tim to kind of comment on. And I think that Prakash is right. You do want to save some of your resource, some of your bets, some of your people to focus on what's happening next. And you want open-minded people doing this to appreciate how it's going to impact you. I mean, there are all sorts of stories in the tech industry for big companies that did not see or appreciate the magnitude of a change coming their way, and they just get blindsided. They get sunk because they could not change, they couldn't adapt. And culture is a big part of that, having an open culture, having what do they call it? The psychological security to be able to speak your mind. And, you have to navigate through politics to do that stuff. I've been in a place where I realized, okay, I shouldn't throw any more good ideas out at the board table. I'm going to tell my boss, and if he likes it, that's what I told him. I said, look, I'm not going to say any more at these meetings. I'm just going to tell you, and if you like it, you say it. And that's what we did. And that's how we got around some problems, because trust me, they would have been bad. So you do have to be cognizant of the culture, but you absolutely have to keep your mind open to new things and have someone focused on that, right, Tim?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's you have to really balance, looking at the future and being able to operationalize, what's in front of you. Because if you're always looking, too far ahead, you're not going to see what's in front of your face, and the business is going to have, is going to have a negative unintended consequence. So, change management is hard. So you really timing is really important. And I also think, we're not a large company. We're small to mid-size, toxicology lab. Getting the right partners, I think, is also important. And that becomes a strategic decision.
Yeah.
So if we look at the data side here, we chose last year to go with Databricks. They're innovating. So in some ways, with their Dolly product that's coming out, it's, they're helping along that journey, because you can't really do it all yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't, switch partners every 6 months,
Right.
and go chase the next new thing,
That's
because you're not going to be able to implement it, and get it to have some staying power. So you really need to balance it. It's very difficult to do, but it's something you have to stay on top of.
Well, and that's actually a great nod to PureStorage, which I'm sure will make Prakash happy. But seriously, what I've loved about PureStorage, every time I've talked to some of your folks at conferences, on these shows and other places, there is this consultative mindset. And the fact is, you've got enough clients that you've seen enough scenarios, enough information architectures, enough plans, enough programs to kind of know where things can go sideways and what those hidden hurdles are going to be. Because when you run into them, if you don't have experience, if you don't have a trusted advisor by your side saying, you want to be careful about refactoring all this right now because of XYZ, if you don't have that guidance, you can spend a lot of money and a lot of time getting absolutely nothing done, and then being even in a worse situation than you were before, right, Prakash?
Yeah, look, we pride ourselves on, because of that data collection, we do a lot of benchmarking and information sharing. So it's not a technical information sharing, but we will tell folks like, hey, people in your industry are typically doing this, and this has worked in the past, this hasn't worked in the past, those types of things. So our models build that, and actually we have this consultative thing we call our value review that our SEs actually do with our customers as part of a QBR. We've operationalized the consultative approach around things we discover and do it. And it's interesting, like from a data collection, we even ask the SEs to check it in so I can tell which ones are doing it, which ones aren't, right? So like that's how maniacal and attention to detail we are on just like operations, right? Just saying, hey, I want to know, and I can, look analytically at the data-driven SEs versus the non-data-driven SEs we have that engage with our customers, right? So that approach, I think, helps create, that high net promoter score that we have, that customer intimacy that we have, and really actually helps train us in terms of what we need to do next for our customers.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And, the sales engineers, those are the fun people, right? I mean, you want to go party in Vegas, get yourself a couple sales engineers, man. They're going to be the ones that get into the weeds, because they know they've been on the front lines. And, the world really is pretty complex. Now we have Stack Overflow, we have user guides, we have all sorts of things that we can turn to. And increasingly, we will have these large language models and small language models to help us with those things, to kind of winnow out the stuff that doesn't matter and really focus on the stuff that does matter. I think that's one of the really powerful use cases for machine learning and large language models in general, is being able to tackle these vast just swaths of unstructured data, make sense of them, pull out meaning, and then be able to parse that and deliver it accordingly. Now, they will need to be trained over time, and this is going to be a little bit of a challenge, I think, for the next couple of years. But, I was talking to Bob Muglia, former CEO of Snowflake, on this show maybe a month ago, and he made a really good point. He goes, I cannot believe the amount of innovation that has occurred in the last 2 months in this space. They're learning very, very quickly, and they're solving some of these big problems very, very quickly. Well, folks, podcast bonus segment is coming up next. You have been listening to DM Radio.